Alright, what I'm going to do today is try and catch some people up that are still really far behind. So I'm going to go over the second practice test for Common Assessment 2 because there's a lot of folks that are either super far behind or still super confused on some of the concepts that are here. So for this first video, I'm just going to go over number 1 and number 2, and then I'll make more videos for each of the next problems. So we start this unit off with knowing a little bit about number properties. And with number 1, we're talking about the opposite and the inverse of numbers, and then the number sets that they belong to. And then in number 2, we're going to talk about number properties like distributive property, commutative property, etc., etc. So the first thing we need to remember when we go over number 1 is what opposite means and what inverse means. And opposite simply means changing the sign. Okay, so when we talk about the opposite of negative 0.20, all we're doing is changing the sign. That's all there is to it. So the opposite of negative 0.20 is positive 0.20. Now, the inverse is where things get a little bit tricky. The inverse is taking the reciprocal of negative 0.20. But what we have to do is rewrite negative 0.20 another way. And hopefully you know your number places, and that'll make everything a lot easier. So negative 0.20 is negative 20 over 100. That's what that decimal is. So if we have negative 20 over 100, we can see that negative 0.20 is in fact a fraction. And what we can do is take the inverse, take the reciprocal of it, and then we would have the reciprocal, which would give us negative 100 over 20, and that, of course, is 5. So the inverse of negative 0.20 is, in fact, negative 5. So we can take the opposite and we can take the inverse of that number. Now, for the number sets, what we have to do is remember what are all of the number sets. And we start with the natural numbers. And the natural numbers are anything that you can hold in your hand. So it starts with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you go to the whole numbers and you throw 0 in there. And then you get to the integers, which are positive and negative whole numbers. So positive and negative whole numbers. After integers, we have rational numbers, which are any number that can be expressed as a fraction. And then if a number is not rational, it's irrational. And all of these numbers belong to the real number set. Okay, so it's all of these are part of the real numbers. Okay, so we look at 0.20, which, as we know, again, is 20 over 100, or 2 over 10, or 1/5. This is actually 1/5. So what number set does that belong to? It's not natural, it's not whole, and if it's not an integer, so it's a rational number. Any number that can be expressed as a fraction. So this is 1/5. It's a rational number. Now, if it's a rational number, it's also real. So this is also a real number. Okay, and then we look to something like negative 5. So negative 5 is not a natural number, it's not a whole number, but it is a negative whole number, right? So negative 5 is an integer. And if a number is an integer, it can be expressed as a fraction, negative 5 over 1. See my video on hidden numbers. So this is also rational, and if it's also rational, it is also real. And so we have to go over all of the number sets to see which of these numbers fit into there. And that's what we have to do for number 1. We have to remember our place values. We have to know how to make a decimal into a fraction. We have to know about opposite, just changing the sign, and inverse, just flipping it. Basically, it's taking the reciprocal. And now we move on to number 2, where we're going to name the properties illustrated in this equation. And basically what we're doing is we're going to take the left-hand side of the equal sign, the A plus B times C plus D, and we're going to make it look like the right-hand side of the equal sign. And so we have to make this look like this. And the first thing we need to do to make this look like this is multiply B times C and B times D. So we're going to multiply those two those numbers. So we have A over here and then B times C, and then B times D. And so we multiply those numbers, and what we have ended up doing is using a property. And that property is called the distributive property. And so we have to label that we've used the distributive property. And so we look at what we have, A plus B, C plus BD. That still doesn't look like this. So we have to make this look like this. So what else can we do? Well, if you see where we need to get, we have to get the right-hand side where we have a BC first, then a BD, then an A. We can rewrite all of these numbers where we have the BC coming first, and then the BD, and then the A. And rewriting numbers like that, because we can, since we're using addition, that is a property. That's called the commutative property of addition. So it's the commutative property of addition. And so that enables us to rewrite things. But now look at the right-hand side. We have parentheses around BD and A. We have grouped BD and A together. And we can do that. We can group numbers in any way we want as long as we're using addition and multiplication. So we can group together BD and A, and the property that allows us to group things like that, since we're using addition or multiplication, is the associative property, like our associates, our group. So that was the associative property. And now look, we have manipulated the left-hand side. We have used each of those properties, and it looks exactly like the right-hand side. And so we have to use each individual step and label each step. And so that's what I'm looking for in number 1 and number 2.